I didn't say a word when Cheryl Whitman, the self-appointed president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, slammed the violation notice down on the table like she was handing me a subpoena from the Supreme Court. She had no idea what I was holding, not just a folder of records, but 30 years of experience dealing with people exactly like her. Bureaucrats with no real power, only the illusion of it, puffed up by community titles and flimsy paperwork. She leaned across the folding table in that beige conference room they like to call a community center and started lecturing me about subdivision design standards and uniform mailbox compliance. I didn't argue. I just slid the deed across the table, the actual county-recorded deed to Parcel 17B, the strip of land their beloved mail center had been sitting on for over 20 years. Her mouth kept moving, but her voice trailed off as she started to read. Then she paused, reread a line, and that was it. In that one quiet moment, without ever raising my voice, I ended a 6-month campaign of fines, threats, and false authority. She blinked. The HOA's lawyer, who always sat 2 seats away from her like some smug little gargoyle, turned pale. I didn't smile. I just waited. It was over before anyone else in that room even realized what had just happened. But before I tell you how I got there, you need to understand what came before it. Because the truth is, I never wanted a fight. I came to Willow Creek to disappear, not to make an example of anyone. But the second they taped that first notice to my door, they made it personal. 3 years before that board meeting, I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment above a pizza place on the edge of the city. My knees were bad, my back worse, and I was clocking 49 hours a week at a contractor supply firm that treated its employees like they were a part of the drywall inventory. My hands were always sore, not from building, I missed that, but from typing warehouse reports and flipping through inventory binders. I'd spent 30 years working in construction, pouring foundation in the mud, measuring roof lines in the blazing sun, calculating slope and grade with my bare hands, while half the crew forgot how to read a level. I loved it, but after decades of deadlines and job site drama, I'd had enough. What I wanted now was peace, the kind of peace you can't buy in a condo complex or a gated subdivision. I wanted a plot of land where I could hear myself think. So when I found the listing for a little 5-acre parcel just outside the Willow Creek development, not part of the HOA, mind you, just next to it, I jumped. The listing said it had a small ranch house that needed minor repairs, which is real estate code for you'll be replacing the water heater, roof, and most of the plumbing. But I didn't mind. That kind of work, the honest kind, was something I could still do. And more importantly, the land was mine. The property had good bones. A single gravel driveway curved up past a patch of pine trees, led to a low-slung house with peeling white paint and a sun-warped front porch. A broken-down barn leaned near the rear tree line like it was ashamed to still be standing. But there was space, quiet, and potential. No HOA dues, no neighbors too close, and just enough road access to keep me connected without feeling fenced in. I spent the first 6 months fixing what I could, replaced the roof myself, re-leveled the floors, swapped out the cracked front windows. I built a small workbench in the garage and spent my evenings carving, sanding, and restoring the kind of things most people throw away. One of the first things I built was a custom cedar mailbox. Nothing fancy, just clean lines, hand-cut joints, sealed for weather. It looked like it belonged there, like it had grown up with the house. I planted it at the edge of my driveway, set it in concrete, and walked back to the porch with a real sense of pride. It sounds silly, I know, but that mailbox felt like a flag planted in the ground, a quiet declaration that this place, this life, was mine now. The Willow Creek subdivision curved around the north side of my parcel. You had to pass their stone entryway to reach the nearest grocery store, and their homes, neat rows of beige siding and approved color palettes, looked like they had been stamped out of a template. I kept to myself. I wasn't part of their community, and I didn't want to be. The parcel map made it clear. My property stood outside the covenant boundaries. I was friendly, but distant. Occasionally, someone would wave. Sometimes a dog would wander into my yard. Nothing dramatic. I didn't attend their meetings. I didn't vote in their little elections. I figured that was the end of it. But I was wrong. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because I was carrying a bag of seed from the truck when I saw it sitting crooked in the box, the return address stamped Willow Creek HOA. I thought maybe it was a newsletter, some fluff about community potlucks or lawn care tips. Instead, it was a formal violation notice, printed in bold, with a photo of my mailbox attached. The letter claimed my mailbox was out of compliance with community design guidelines and had been reported by a concerned resident. The fine was $250 with daily penalties to accrue if I didn't remove or replace it with an approved design. I stared at it for a full minute, thinking there had to be a mistake. I wasn't part of the HOA. I never signed their CC&Rs. My parcel was older than their entire subdivision, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I wrote them a letter. Back. It was polite, straightforward. I explained the history of my property and included a scanned copy of my deed, clearly showing the boundary lines. I even attached a highlighted section of the county zoning map, pointing out how my parcel sat outside their jurisdiction. I mailed it certified and expected that would be the end of it. A simple clerical error, easily resolved. But 2 weeks. Later, I found a second notice, this time taped to my garage. The fine had jumped to $750. The tone was more aggressive, warning that continued refusal to comply with community standards would result in escalated legal action, including property lines and access restrictions. I remember standing there, holding the paper in one hand, coffee in the other, watching a white SUV crawl past at half speed before speeding up when I turned. That was the moment the peace cracked. Not shattered, not yet, but cracked. Because I could feel it now, the surveillance, the pettiness. Someone in that subdivision had decided I was a problem. Maybe because I didn't sign up, maybe because I wasn't uniform, or maybe just because I dared to build something myself instead of ordering from an HOA-approved catalog. Either way, they were coming after me, and I had a choice to make. Either roll over and paint my mailbox beige, or start digging. I chose the latter. After the second notice, I still wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe a misfiled address or some overzealous volunteer on the HOA board trying to rack up compliance points like they were playing some bureaucratic video game. I still believed deep down that a reasonable explanation, coupled with a dose of patience, would resolve it. So I tried again. I printed out my full deed, complete with parcel boundaries and legal description, and drove it to the HOA's office myself. They operated out of a one-room trailer behind the community clubhouse, all beige vinyl siding and those sad, half-broken blinds that always seemed to be stained with coffee. The woman at the desk barely looked up when I entered. I told her I wasn't a member, showed her the documents, and left the paperwork with a note asking the board to please update their records and withdraw the violation. She nodded vaguely, scribbled something in a notepad, and said someone would follow up. That was the last polite interaction I had with them. A week later, I received a third notice, this time in bold red lettering printed on heavier. Stock like they thought a thicker piece of paper would somehow make it more legal. The fine was now $1,200, and the language had escalated. They cited willful noncompliance, warned of pending legal lien placement, and said they had received multiple complaints from community members regarding the structure's appearance. What structure? My mailbox? The one I carved, by hand from reclaimed cedar. I had worked with city inspectors, OSHA, and site supervisors for decades. And I'd never seen something so full of bluster and so devoid of substance. But it wasn't the letter that changed me. It was what I found taped to my garage the next morning, a printed sheet with a full-color photo of my home, not just the mailbox, and red arrows drawn over it. One pointing to the cedar box, another to the trim around my garage, and one circling the patch of gravel I used to back my truck in. They were watching me. Someone had walked onto my property, taken that photo, and submitted it to the board. That was when the last bit of naivete fell away. I realized this wasn't about rules. It wasn't about mailboxes. It wasn't even about compliance. It was about control, about a group of people, so obsessed with order and uniformity that the mere existence of something different, something they couldn't regulate, offended them. And they were willing to bully, lie, and escalate to get their way. I'd seen this before on construction sites, junior project managers trying to push their weight around, hoping no one would call their bluff. But out here, on my own land, that was different. That was personal. I didn't get angry, not in the way you might think. I didn't throw the letter in a fire pit or go banging on doors. What I felt was colder than that, focused. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the documents spread out in front of me, a pot of coffee at my elbow, and the old blueprints of the property rolled out from when I first purchased the place. I called up the county GIS website, pulled the digital plat maps, and started cross-referencing every lot, every parcel boundary, and every recorded easement within a mile radius. I began compiling a list of every HOA document I could legally request: covenants, meeting minutes, permit applications, zoning overlays. The next morning, I submitted a formal records request to the HOA under the state's nonprofit transparency laws. They had 10 business days to respond. In the meantime, I paid a visit to the county clerk's office. Now, if you've never spent an afternoon digging through land use archives, I don't blame you. It's not glamorous work. But what you find there is gold. The kind of gold that doesn't glitter, but holds up in court. I pulled the original subdivision filing for Willow Creek, reviewed the master plan, and scanned through every transfer of ownership, easement, and infrastructure map dating back to the mid-'80s. That's when I found something odd. Parcel 17B. A narrow slice of land, just a sliver really, originally carved out for utility access before the development broke ground. According to the records, it had been leased temporarily to a postal development contractor in the early 2000s, a group that no longer existed. The lease had expired, but the parcel hadn't been transferred to the HOA. It had been absorbed, by default, into the parent property. My property. The mail center stood on it, that small beige structure with the HOA's crest proudly affixed. Above the lockboxes, the one they loved to tout as a shared community feature in their newsletters, was physically located on a piece of land that, according to the official county records, was part of the parcel I now owned. And nobody, not a soul on that board, had ever updated the plat, filed a new deed, or negotiated a proper lease. They had built it there on a lapsed assumption, and then fined me for a mailbox that stood 300 feet away, on land they didn't control. I didn't laugh. I didn't rage. I just sat there in the archives room looking at the overlapping parcel boundaries and felt the weight of it settle over me like armor. They had picked a fight with the wrong man, not because I was dangerous, but because I was thorough. That night, I called an old friend from my contracting days, now a land use attorney with a reputation for quiet, surgical work. I emailed him what I'd found. The next morning, we spoke for 45 minutes. He asked a few sharp questions. I answered them. Then there was a pause, and he said, "They've trespassed, Jim, for over a decade. And now they're issuing fines based on a jurisdiction they don't even hold. You're not just clear. You're in position to make them beg. I didn't want to sue. Not yet. That wasn't the point. What I wanted was clarity. Leverage. I wanted them to understand just how badly they'd miscalculated. So I asked my friend to draft a formal demand letter. Nothing aggressive, just facts. Clear documentation of property ownership, lease, expiration, and unlawful use. A list of demands, immediate rescission of all fines, removal of the violation record, and acknowledgement of boundary error. I had it notarized, copied, and filed with the county. And I requested to speak at the next HOA board meeting, not as a member, not as a neighbor, as a landowner. I arrived at the HOA board meeting 15 minutes early, wearing the same boots I'd worn when I first walked this land. Not out of nostalgia, but because I wanted to feel grounded. They held the meeting in the community clubhouse, a modest building with vinyl floors and collapsible chairs, the kind of space more suited to birthday parties than confrontation. The board sat at a plastic fold-out table draped in a thin blue cloth like they were the town council in a school play. 7 of them, 5 women and 2 men, each with a nameplate, a clipboard, and an air of unearned authority. Around 20 residents were in attendance, murmuring and sipping from styrofoam cups of weak coffee. Some glanced my way as I took a seat in the back. I didn't wave. I didn't nod. I just waited. When the meeting began, they followed a strict agenda. Budget updates, landscaping proposals, a minor argument over whether basketball hoops should be allowed on driveways during weekends, all the usual theater of suburban governance. Then, during the final portion, community comments. I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My name is James Ellison. I'm here tonight to formally respond to the violation notices issued against my property at 404 Cypress Bend Lane. The room shifted. One board member, Karen Biederman, if I recall correctly, adjusted her glasses and offered a polite but clipped smile. Yes, Mr. Ellison. We've sent several notices about that mailbox. Have you come to resolve the fine? No, I said. I've come to clarify why you'll be rescinding it. I held up a copy of the letter my attorney drafted, sealed and time-stamped, and began reading. To whom it may concern, this is a formal notice that the structure identified by your association as a community mail center is located on Parcel 17B, which is legally included in the deed and surveyed boundaries of my private property. As of the expiration of the temporary use lease filed in 2003 and never renewed, the continued presence and use of this structure constitutes unlawful trespass. That's when the murmurs started. People leaned forward. A few turned to each other in quiet confusion. The board stiffened. I continued. In addition, all compliance citations, fines, and enforcement actions issued against my residents lack jurisdictional basis, as my property is not, and has never been, subject to the Willow Creek HOA charter, nor recorded within its enforceable boundaries. All future attempts to collect or enforce such fines will be documented as harassment and referred for civil remedy. Silence. The kind of silence that comes right after a car crash or the dropping of a heavy gavel in a courtroom. I let it linger. Then, calmly, I stepped forward and handed the letter to the board president. She didn't take it immediately. Her hand hovered awkwardly, fingers twitching, before she finally accepted the envelope and laid it on the table, like it might burn through the plastic. I'm not here to cause trouble, I said. But I do expect the removal of all false violations within 7 business days. And I expect acknowledgement that the mail center, which you've placed on my land, is there at my discretion, not yours. I turned to leave. That should have been the end of it. But Karen, always one step too bold for her own good, spoke up. We believe that land is common area, she said, her voice raised, brittle with panic masked as confidence. That mail center has served the community for over a decade. I turned back, slow and deliberate. That's the problem, I said. You believed. You didn't check. Then I walked out. The next morning, I received an email from the board secretary asking for a meeting to discuss possible terms. I didn't respond right away. I gave them a week, the full 7 business days, and then filed a notice of encroachment with the county. I included photographic evidence, surveyor's maps, and a digital copy of the expired lease. Legally, that structure was now in violation of my property rights, and I was entitled to seek removal or enforce a lease at a rate of my choosing. That's when they started to sweat. 2 days later, a second email arrived. This one far more polite. "We would like to resolve this matter amicably," it read. "Would you be open to allowing continued use of the mail center in exchange for a monthly stipend or written easement?" And there it was. The shift, the subtle transition from posturing to panic. They'd gone from fining me $9,000 over a mailbox to offering rent for the right to use a building they didn't know they didn't own. I didn't smile when I read it. I didn't even feel satisfaction. What I felt was control, the calm, earned kind. The kind that comes from knowing the truth and watching your opponents fumble to catch up. I wrote back a single sentence. "I'll consider a lease proposal once all fines have been rescinded in writing." Within 24 hours, I received a formal letter of apology. They called it a clerical error, a classic maneuver hoping to save face. The fines were rescinded, the violation removed from their books. They even offered to refresh communication protocols to avoid future misunderstandings. I waited 2 more days before replying. I proposed a lease, $250 per month, retroactive to the date of the first fine. It wasn't about the money, though it certainly didn't hurt. It was about drawing a line. If they wanted to keep that, building their precious little mailroom, they'd pay for it, just like any tenant. I even offered a discounted rate if they agreed to include a written acknowledgement in their HOA minutes stating that Parcel 17B was private property, not governed by their charter. They accepted. 3 months later, a small bronze plaque appeared on the side of the mailroom. "This structure is located on private property and used with permission." They didn't hold a ribbon cutting. There was no community newsletter announcement. But every resident who walked up to retrieve their mail had to pass by those words. I didn't speak much at future board meetings, not unless something truly required my attention, but I always made sure they saw me at the back of the room. Calm, present, unmoved. I was no longer the outsider. I was the man who owned the ground beneath their feet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't swing a hammer or burn a bridge. I just sat back and watched the ripples unfold. Within 6 months of the lease agreement being signed, the mood around the neighborhood changed. It wasn't dramatic. No, shouting matches or major resignations. But you could feel it in the air, like static before a storm. The HOA board meetings, once smugly efficient and overconfident, grew quieter, more cautious. They spoke in clipped phrases, legal terminology, suddenly laced into every sentence. "Let's verify that parcel status. Have we confirmed jurisdiction? Please attach the easement documentation." Their confidence had been replaced with paperwork. They'd learned a new word, boundaries. And I kept to myself. I maintained the property as I always had, mowed, neat, respectful. But every now and then, I'd notice a few homeowners slowing down in front of my place, not in the nosy, judgmental way they used to, but in the way people do when they're rethinking a story they thought they understood. Some would nod at me as I walked to the end of the driveway. Some would stop and ask questions, polite ones. "Hey, didn't know you'd been here that long?" Or, "That mailroom thing, is that true?" I never elaborated. I'd just smile. Maybe say, "Property lines are funny things. Let them chew on it." Word got out, of course. Small towns, even ones dressed up as gated communities, have long memories and faster gossip. It wasn't just that I'd beaten the HOA. It was that I'd done it with something they didn't even know mattered. Land. A scrap of soil, a forgotten clause, a lease they'd let expire because they thought ownership ended at the curb. That lesson? It stuck. In time, other residents began looking into their own deeds. Some discovered discrepancies in fencing lines, setbacks, even irrigation rights. A few challenged fines of their own, and won. Not everyone had a trump card like mine, but the precedent had been set. The illusion of unchecked power had cracked. And that's the thing about power. Once people see it can bleed, they stop being afraid of it. Karen Biederman eventually stepped down. No announcement, no ceremony. She simply didn't show up to the annual board election, and a neighbor of mine, a former Navy logistics officer named Greg, took her place. He was calm, measured, and didn't much care for pointless regulation. "Let people live," he told me one afternoon while walking his dog past my driveway. "You showed him how to read a map. That's all most of us ever needed." The mailbox they once hated stayed exactly where it was. I never changed a thing, never upgraded it, never painted it. Still metal, still plain. But now, it was a symbol. Not of rebellion. I wasn't some HOA outlaw, but of grounding. A reminder that the rules only reach so far, and after that it's all about what's written in black ink and sealed at the county courthouse. About a year later, I got a letter in the mail, not from the HOA, but from a homeowner 2 streets over. Handwritten, thoughtful. He said his daughter had just bought her first home, and after hearing about what happened here, he encouraged her to study her deed like scripture. He thanked me, not for making noise, but for proving you could be quiet and still be firm. That stuck with me. We live in an age where revenge is often painted as something loud and fast, people storming in with cameras, threats, lawsuits. But the best kind of justice, at least in my eyes, isn't the one that embarrasses people. It's the one that teaches them, quietly, permanently. There was a small moment, maybe a year and a half after the whole incident, when I caught the new board president walking around the mailroom with a clipboard and a contractor. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but I overheard one line clear as day. "Make sure we're not touching his property line. I don't want another Ellison situation." And I'll admit, that made me chuckle. Some people build reputations. Others let them grow like roots underground, invisible but impossible to pull out. The check for the mailroom lease still comes every month. They offered to pay the full year in advance once, but I declined. I prefer the reminder. Every 30 days they have to acknowledge me. Not with fanfare, not with fear, but with respect. Legal respect. I haven't raised the rate, and I don't intend to. I'm not greedy. What I wanted was acknowledgement, and I got it. The fine they levied against me, the one for non-compliant mailbox design, feels like a relic now, a scrap from an era that forgot to check its own paperwork, and the final irony? That original fine, the $9,000 threat, was issued because I had a mailbox that didn't match the community aesthetic. Now, because of the lease they signed, my property is technically exempt from all aesthetic compliance. I could plant pink flamingos up and down the driveway if I wanted to. I don't. But the point stands. The one property they tried hardest to force into compliance is now the only one fully immune to it. Funny how things work. I still keep that letter from the board, the formal apology, in my file drawer. Not because I want to frame it or show it off, just because it's proof of what happens when you stay calm, when you know what's yours, when you remember that silence, paired with the right paperwork, is louder than any argument. They fined me over a mailbox, but I owned the land their entire operation was built on, and now every time they check their mail, they remember it.